America's waterways move soybeans, corn, grain products, and more from family farms to feed the world. U.S. agriculture's positive trade balance relies on efficient waterways to transport these products at the lowest cost. From the upper Mississippi River to the Gulf, our waterways provide efficient, safe, environmentally sound ways to move freight. Modern waterways move America forward toward a stronger U.S. economy. Brought to you by Waterways Council and its stakeholders.
Well, thanks for joining us here for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week in Review. I'm Spencer Chase, joined as always by Agri-Pulse Senior Editor Phil Brasher, discussing the week that was, agriculturally speaking, in Washington, D.C. And if you've been following the news, you know the first topic we're going to talk about is obviously the choice of Kevin McCarthy not to run for Speaker of the House. He was seen as a leading candidate within the House GOP as someone who could take over for the seat that is going to be vacated by John Boehner here. We thought at the end of October, more on that timeline later to come, I would presume. But Phil, you were there just outside the meeting. The news broke around noon Thursday. You were there. What was the scene like, and what does this mean for agriculture? Because he was really seen as one of the candidates that might be the best for the ag industry.
Right. Well, later, actually, one Democrat off the House floor described it probably better than anyone, and I think in a way that a lot of Republicans would agree with. He said it was the House Republicans were a caucus in chaos, and that was very much the case after McCarthy dropped this bombshell and said he was dropping out of the race for Speaker because he couldn't unify the caucus. And the basic problem is that there are about 40 to 50 hardline conservative members. They're part of what's called the House Freedom Caucus, who are demanding a lot of commitments out of the next leader. They're unhappy with the current leadership. They don't think that the current leadership has been forceful enough in trying to push bills to the Senate and to the President, even though they're likely to get vetoed. So now it's totally up in the air in terms of who's going to be the next speaker, how long the current speaker, John Boehner, is going to stay around. And what this means for agriculture, probably the biggest issue is what happens to the Republican agenda this fall. And that is up in the air as well, too. Agriculture is looking for both a long-term highway bill. Negotiations are going on that, and just as critical is or perhaps more critical is a fiscal 2016 budget bill, because that is the place that Republicans are counting on to attack and block several of the regulations and rules that the Obama administration has put into place.
You mentioned things like the budget, like the highway bill. These are still things that need to be addressed, with a varying degree of timelines. The highway bill is going to run out of funding, or the highway department is going to run out of funding at the end of October. They've got a CR for the budget that goes through mid-December. Right. What is today's announcement? I mean, it wasn't a slam dunk that Leader McCarthy was going to end up with this seat, but it was, obviously presumed within the Washington community that this was his job to lose. Now that he hasn't essentially lost it, but he is giving it up, what does that do to these timelines for things like a highway bill, like a budget going forward?
Well, the leadership in the House and the Senate, including Speaker Boehner, have been talking to the White House about at least the top line of a budget bill, so that starting in November, the members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees could start working on the details of the broad budget bill, including the various policy riders that might be included. So now you have this whole, what was a cloud over the House leadership is even a bigger, murkier cloud.
A little more thunderous.
After the vote, there were some members of the Republican caucus calling for a caretaker, an interim speaker, to fill Boehner's seat, to fill the speakership through the rest of the year. Other Republicans have rejected that outright, including the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Mike Conaway. He said a interim speaker just doesn't have leverage, essentially a lame duck. Conaway said something else that's interesting, I think, that tells you a lot about where the Republican caucus is at this moment. He said, we have to learn to coexist with each other.
You know, it wouldn't be surprising to hear him, invoke that kind of language speaking with House Democrats, but now speaking within his own caucus, there's still that level of divide.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting following this because Speaker Boehner has said today that he's the speaker until he isn't anymore, and he had previously announced intentions to give up the gavel at the end of October. That might be up in the air at this point too, just because they haven't scheduled a new vote for a new Speaker of the House, and he just said he's going to be the Speaker until he isn't. In other news, another major agricultural development this week, which has been something that the agricultural community has been working on and hoping for months, maybe even years. That is, of course, the development of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. On late Sunday night, early Monday morning, an agreement in principle was reached between the negotiating parties on that, the last snafu or last hang-up being in regards to dairy programs with New Zealand. But there is an agreement in principle on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Phil, right away, the administration went on just an absolute full-court press trying to get this agreement, a lot of support for this agreement. We're unsure when, the exact date that it will come before the Congress for a vote for approval. It's looking like that's going to go into 2016, but it's clear that the administration is going to be looking for support for this agreement, and they're looking for a lot of that support from the agricultural community.
Right. I don't think it's going too far to say that agriculture is going to be the engine that drives this train that is TPP, which is likely to, it looks like it'll probably be up in this next spring. There's a long period, actually 90 days, that the agreement has to be, the text of the agreement has to be public before the president can even sign it. The text itself, the White House says, should be out in the next 30 days or so. So, to elaborate on why we know that agriculture is going to be so critical to this agreement, on Tuesday, one day after the agreement was actually announced, they had a meeting, the first sort of the launch of the president's drive for getting congressional approval of TPP was a meeting at, of all places, the Agriculture Department. There were about 18 business leaders brought there, 3 of them from agriculture. But the most interesting thing is that the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, Bob Stallman, was seated right next to the president. That guaranteed that every picture from that meeting, all the video from that meeting showed Bob Stallman, president of the American Farm Bureau, sitting right next to the president. That tells you a lot.
And some people might think that's a coincidence. The White House doesn't do a lot of things by accident.
No.
I mean, there was a level of intention there. But right. Phil, I mean, you mentioned that agriculture is going to be kind of the engine that drives this train. But I mean, there's going to be some people within agriculture that aren't necessarily thrilled with the way that this negotiation turned out. I mean, there were some concessions given to Canada on the dairy program. There's going to be a little bit more sugar imported, and obviously there are folks like the National Farmers Union that are opposed to this trade agreement in principle. So how is that going to balance going forward?
Well, actually, when you get down to it, I don't know that dairy and sugar did all that badly. They had both defensive and offensive positions because they both have tariffs or quotas in the case of sugar that protect them and protect them against imports from other countries, like in the case of dairy, New Zealand, in the case of sugar, Australia. So, for example, Australia got a commitment to be able to export 65,000 tons of sugar into the United States. But those 65,000 tons of sugar will be offset by a reduction in how much sugar Mexico can export into the United States. So as long as that quota remains in place for Mexico, then it's a wash for sugar producers. Same thing pretty much for dairy.
So as much as we do know about the development of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think it's safe to say there's 5 or 10 times as much that we don't know. We haven't seen the final text. It's still going through translation, some technical issues right now. There's going to be a lot of news coming forward on the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the coming months. We'll be sure to stay on top of that and many other agricultural issues as they develop here in Washington, D.C. For Phil Brasher, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.